It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me thank the Latvian presidency. Just turn this down on. Thank the Latvian presidency and the Elcano Institute for the invitation. Of course, a very timely moment to discuss the neighborhood policy. We're having very intense discussion at the level of the EU institutions and member states about what our neighborhood policy should be in the future. So every input and every opportunity to debate this is helpful. Sometimes the questions become too abstract and disconnected from real problems. We have to try to avoid that. So first, one point on neighborhood policy. I hear many times that the EU should be concerned about its global role and not so much about the neighborhood. Well, two things about this. First, the neighborhood policy was supposed to be about Europe's global role. Europe had three ways to play an active role in global affairs. First, its own integration process and enlargement. Second, the ability to shape its neighborhood through neighborhood policy. And third, the ability to inspire regional integration according to the EU model in other parts of the world. It was a very ambitious process, almost to reshape the world in the image of the EU, let's be honest about that. And the neighborhood policy was part of that. So it's not a parochial policy or a parochial strategy. It's part of a very ambitious global strategy, and we may discuss whether it was too ambitious and whether it's been successful or not. But that's how I would interpret it. Second, let's look at the crisis in the East and crisis in the South. We're dealing with global issues. On the East, we're dealing with the post-1989 order, whether it's in need of revision, whether we'll be forced to struggle through a period of disorder and find a new global order, or whether we can preserve the order that came out of 1989, 1991. No issue could be more important than this, and it's what's being decided in Ukraine and in the Eastern neighborhood right now. And then the South, it's the question of the dialogue of civilizations, and the question of how different cultures can live together and can reach a common understanding. The question of Islam as well. So no bigger global issues could be present than these two. And if they take the form of neighborhood issues, it's not because they are small neighborhood issues. They are huge neighborhood issues. And the fact that they are being discussed in the context of our neighborhood policy is more or less a contingent fact. They needed to be discussed anyway. And in these terms, it's actually a positive development that the EU is now at the center of these two global debates. In some respects, more at the center than the US is, in both cases. So no reason to think that the EU is becoming more parochial because of its neighborhood policy. The southern neighborhood, I'll talk a little bit about the southern neighborhood, about neighborhood policy and how it could be revised. I'll talk also a little bit about the Mediterranean crisis because I think we need to make an effort to clarify what EU policy is. I see a lot of misunderstanding in the newspapers the last week or two, and I feel every opportunity we have to clarify some of the decisions that were made recently and some important ideas that will come out tomorrow in the Commission communication on migration policy. All that is important. The southern neighborhood. There's one very important question that I don't see discussed enough, and I think it's the most important question when it comes to the southern neighborhood. And this is still the question of the Arab Spring. How to interpret the Arab Spring and how to interpret what came after. In some respects, we had an Arab thermidor, for those who are familiar with French Revolution history, but certainly different from the original one. And it's still unclear how to link those two moments and how to think about what will come after this Arab thermidor. But the EU will need to develop a position on the question of what it expects from its southern neighborhood in terms of its democratic transition. Does it expect every country in the southern neighborhood to have a full democratic transition? Is this the strategic goal, but are we willing to be patient tactically in how we achieve it? Or on the contrary, have we decided that it's not even our strategic goal to have a full democratic transition in all countries of our southern neighborhood? This for me is the crucial issue, poses very delicate political issues. I think the EU should be careful not to turn any country in our southern neighborhood as the absolute model for all the other countries. This is a risk and a danger that we should try to avoid. But of course we will be pushed to do that. We will be pushed to pick sides in what is an important debate taking place, especially in North Africa right now, about where the region will go in political terms. Some of these issues are better discussed in private than in public, I have to say, but they also need to be discussed in public, and I don't see enough discussion about it. In some sense, our discussion about neighborhood policy is a bit too bureaucratic, too technical, with its principles of differentiation, co-ownership, flexibility. That's all very good, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But in the end, it's the strategy that matters, and when it comes to the strategy, it's our position on the issue of the Arab Spring, the Arab Thermidor, different models for politics and societies in North Africa, the necessity not to pick sides while subscribing to the values that are our values. These are the most delicate and the most important questions when it comes to the southern neighborhood. Mediterranean crisis, it has many different aspects. So the last 2 weeks, I heard a lot about how the EU had picked a security-based approach to the Mediterranean crisis, and this is not true. The EU has picked a security-based approach to a security problem, which is criminal networks of smugglers. And this has to be dealt with on security terms. It cannot be dealt with in any other terms. And people, of course, know how these networks operate. They are based on near slavery models of extracting money from migrants, forcing them to work for 3-4 years until they can pay for their tickets to immigrate to Europe without any conditions. I think it's the duty of the EU to respond to this security issue with a security-based approach. But there's a number of other approaches. There's the political decision to develop a more open immigration policy, legal immigration policy, and this will be presented tomorrow, and you'll all be able to see. And then there's the foreign policy and military issue, which, in my opinion, ends up being the most important of the three and the basis for solving the Mediterranean crisis in the future. And I mean, of course, the situation in Libya and then the situation in Syria and the Sahel. This is where the Mediterranean crisis is ultimately coming from collapsing states in a number of regions. And of course, a problem of collapsing states cannot be solved through a generous immigration policy by the EU. Perhaps this is not a popular thing to say, but I think it's an obvious thing to say. You cannot solve a problem of collapsing states by having open immigration, unless what you have in mind is that these states would simply disappear and their populations would relocate to Europe as a whole. I'm sure no one means this, so the problem of these collapsing states has to be solved, and this is part of the broad strategy. So there really is no security-based approach, and what we have is, for a very difficult problem, a four-pronged approach. Security question, foreign policy question, immigration question, and a military crisis, in particular in Libya and in Syria. European neighborhood policy and its revision. I agree with and we in the Portuguese government agree with the basic principles that have been talked about. Differentiation, I think someone already said this is more or less obvious. We need to think a little more about how to do it. Flexibility, I think this is probably more important, and what's being talked about when we talk about flexibility is European neighborhood policy needs to be able to respond to short-term issues and emergencies. And in the past, I think it's clear that it was defined as a long-term policy. Its horizon was 10, 20 years of slow transformation. And if something was made very clear in the last 2-3 years is that we are constantly being forced to respond to sudden emergencies, either in the east or in the south. And so EU neighborhood policy needs to acquire a level of flexibility, which will not be so easy, by the way. There's, of course, always a very high level of rule following at the EU level, and this makes it difficult to react quickly to emergencies. And then the question of co-ownership, which is particularly important for the South. I think co-ownership, in a sense, has already been fully assimilated in the East. The very intense debates we have with our 6 Eastern partners are, in a way, already an indicator of co-ownership. We may disagree on some issues, but we're having this debate together with them. And we're talking about the same things. With the South, I think this is still very much a work in progress, still to do. And what we hear from our Southern partners is precisely the opposite, is the idea, either fair or unfair, I'm not going to pronounce on that, but the idea that European neighborhood policy is decided by Europe unilaterally and then imposed on our Southern neighborhoods. And this complaint has been voiced a number of times in the last few months. We need to make a real effort, which I think the Barcelona meeting was part of this, and a very successful part of it, of making an effort to show that whether it was the case in the past or not, it will not be the case in the future, and that European neighborhood policy will be developed together with our southern neighborhoods. And finally, conditionality. I entirely agree that we have to rethink the idea of conditionality. Conditionality has to go together with a sense of belonging to a common project. It cannot be a pure contract where you exchange some advantage for something else, for something that the other side doesn't want to give you or doesn't want to do, but in exchange for some material advantage, you try to do it. This is not a good way to think about our neighborhood policy. We can have conditionality in terms of if one of our partners wants to be part of a common project, let us say the Energy Union or Horizon 2020 or some more ad hoc temporary project, then there's a number of criteria that one has to fulfill in order to be part of this common project. But I think this is the sense in which conditionality works, because you feel part of a common project and you don't feel you're exchanging something for something else. So this also needs to be rethought, and it's also particularly important in the South, where I think there's a number of projects that we should be focusing on. Perhaps European neighborhood policy, when it comes to the southern neighborhood, has to abandon some of the transformational ambitions that it had and focus on a number of bread and butter issues, energy, trade, and try to get concrete results on those issues. Try to get more energy interconnections between the two sides of the Mediterranean, more energy projects, even if they are for the future, and try also to get some developments on trade and on trade agenda, which seems to have been blocked for a long time when it comes in particular to the Maghreb, where we have the possibility of finalizing a number of important deep and comprehensive free trade agreements. And in this respect, the southern neighborhood has fallen a bit behind. I think it should be a priority of the next 2 years to catch up in terms of trade policy and to make sure that we conclude some of these deep and comprehensive free trade agreements, in particular with Morocco and Tunisia. Thank you.